Well, I appreciate the invitation and I'm looking forward to talking with you. I understand that what you wanted me to do from what Gina said was
Mm.
do a brief 30, 40-minute presentation of some of my work and then
Hmm.
we'll have time for discussion. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, that would be
Absolutely.
perfect. Yeah, thank you
And
very much for being
and
here.
if you allow me, I would love to just say a couple of words about you, not only about our project. So let me briefly introduce you. So today this is Dr. or Professor Dr. Tedeschi, who earned his bachelor in psychology from Syracuse University and his PhD in clinical psychology from Ohio University. He completed his clinical psychology internship at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. He was a professor of psychology at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And I'm not sure whether you are still engaged. You are a professor emeritus, but you taught or may still teach personality and psychotherapy. And you serve as the coordinator for the clinical community psychology program there. You are a licensed psychologist who specialized in bereavement and trauma, and you led support groups for bereaved parents for over 20 years. So, together with your colleague, Lawrence Calhoun, you have been publishing extensively on post traumatic growth. You explored personal transformations following traumatic events. And the notable works from you and your colleague include Trauma and Transformation from 1995, Post Traumatic Growth from 1998, Facilitating Post Traumatic Growth from 1999, and Helping Bereaved Parents, a Clinical Guide from 2000, and not least, the Handbook of Post Traumatic Growth from 2006. Dr. Tedeschi also consults for the American Psychological Association, Trauma and Resilience, and serves as a subject matter expert for the U.S. Army's comprehensive soldier fitness program. He was a finalist for the Bank of America Award for Teaching Excellence and received the Mary Clark Award for Distinguished Service to Psychology from the North Carolina Psychological Associations. Where you, if it's still correct, are still currently president. I don't know, but this is what I got from the internet.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Marcus. Let me just take off from where you got your information from the internet and explain that I am professor emeritus at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. But since I finished up with my last doctoral students a couple of years ago, I'm no longer actively teaching there. Um, and um, and since then, I've been serving as executive director of the Boulder Crest Institute for Posttraumatic Growth, which is part of a foundation, a nonprofit foundation, which was established a little over 10 years ago to serve military service members, veterans, and first
Mm-hmm.
responders like police officers, firefighters, emergency medical service technicians, who have, of course, um, work lives that are full of trauma. And so what we have done there is we've established programs for these populations based on the post-traumatic growth model. So it's a quite robust application of the work that I've done as a researcher at the university over the years. It's been very satisfying to see that work transformed into so many active approaches to intervening with people who experience trauma as a part of their lives on a unfortunately regular basis. So I want to talk a little bit about how my research work has been applied there. So we can see the ways that this has continued to inform us about this whole process of response to trauma in ways that are sometimes surprisingly positive. So that's what I'll talk to you about. And and again, I very much appreciate your invitation. And I want to say that your grant from the Templeton Foundation, of course, a very impressive thing. I congratulate you on that. It's a wonderful organization, and I'm glad they're funding this kind of work.
Thank you so much. We are very happy to have you here. Do you have any slides that you want to share?
No, I didn't. I didn't prepare any slides for today.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
If that's okay, I'll just talk with you.
Definitely, for sure.
Okay. And so let me just tackle three different things. First, I want to explain the way that my colleague Lawrence Calhoun and I first started to think about trauma, what it is, how to define it, what the experience of it is. And then I want to talk with you about what we found in our research that the process of response to trauma looks like that leads to post-traumatic growth. And I will talk with you about what post-traumatic growth experiences are about for people. I want to point out that our work originated back in the 1980s when we first started we wanted to learn something about wisdom, actually. We want to learn what wisdom really has developed, interest in personality growth, perhaps. But that was the kind of the origin story of this. And we thought that we would start by looking at the literature. And at that time in the 1980s in psychology, there wasn't much empirical study of wisdom. So that left us kind of an open field in a way. And we thought, well, why don't we just start in a qualitative way and just interview people we think may be wise? So those people turned out to be people we chose, people who are older people, because of course the folk idea of wisdom is that the elderly have that, and there's the wisdom of the aged and all of that. So we went to people who were bereaved in late adult life. So these were people mostly in their 80s and older, reflecting on what they learned about living life. So we did that. And we also talked to people who had suffered physical disabilities in adulthood and done very well. So we had contacts in the rehabilitation community, and we talked to people who had been paralyzed, blinded by illnesses, injuries, and the like, but had done very well in the aftermath of rehabilitation. So on the first page of a first book we wrote in 1995 about this, we quoted one of the people I interviewed in this qualitative study who was paralyzed, and he was a man in his late 20s. And he told me that the accident which paralyzed him was the best thing that ever happened to him. And then he said, I understand that's pretty hard for anyone to believe, but then he told the story of it, and the story made it clear that the life that he was leading before his accident and after his accident was very, very different. And he was very grateful for the life he was leading in the aftermath of all of this. And it was very meaningful and purposeful for him. And that kind of story we found was not too unusual. Now, not everyone would tell us that they were pleased that they had gone through some terrible trauma, but some did actually say just what he said. But they were appreciative of life post-trauma that they had been able to fashion for themselves. So out of that, we developed a quantitative system of assessing this that we called the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory. That's now been translated into over 2 dozen languages. We've done a lot of studies around the world and found that these kinds of reports are commonplace, no matter what the culture might be, where people might be living and what they're experiencing as their particular traumatic events that are catalysts. So what we then ended up understanding was that we have to understand trauma in the eye of the beholder, the person who's experiencing it. That's where we started, by talking with people about their experiences, listening to what they did teach us about that. And that the thing that trauma does, and the way we end up defining it, comes out of the work of people who think about life experiences in terms of schema, and the effect of life experiences on these cognitive structures, or schemas, especially the work of Ronnie Jonoff Bullman from the University of Massachusetts. And what's traumatic then for people is when their schemas, their life cognitive structure is challenged or shattered. So they have to rethink what they had assumed about various things that were happening in their lives and who they are and how life would go. So there's a core belief system, sometimes called the assumptive world, the world that people assume they're living in and living through, that gets turned upside down, shattered, challenged by certain kind of events. And that's what makes things traumatic. When people do not understand anymore what it is that they're going through and what their future is and what their identity is, and it's all changed and it's hard to understand. And it's very anxiety arousing and confusing. And that's traumatic. But out of that disruption of the core belief system and the assumptive world, there is a possibility for a reconstruction of this system that points people in some new directions with new understandings of themselves, how to live life, how to move forward. And it's out of that reconstructive process that we get post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth then is a process. It's a process of change that happens over time when people are trying to reconstruct this assumptive world or core belief system. And that process has a number of steps to it. And in our research, we've come to understand that process pretty well. And the process is pretty much the same, no matter what the original event might be, or series of events, what the catalysts might be. So the process involves the disruption to the core belief system, which produces a lot of anxiety. And out of that anxiety, we get intrusive rumination, ruminative processes. They're very distressing for people. And this means that they try to cope in various ways with that. And those coping processes sometimes fail. And they're stuck in this rumination and this anxiety. And out of all of that traumatic misery, which is well documented and understood by people who work in the area of trauma and has been for a long time. But out of that, there are people who often find ways through it which lead to the outcomes of post-traumatic growth. And the way to the outcome tends to be through some sort of connection with another person or persons who are companions in this process, and hear about what is happening to the person, can stand by them for the period of time that they need to go through all of this, and start to introduce them perhaps to new schematic structures or understandings of living their lives and who they are. So this ushers in a deliberative ruminative process, not an intrusive one, but a more reflective, deliberate process of rumination. And out of that, people come to new understandings of themselves, the world they live in, the future they might have, their identity, concepts about how controllable life is, how predictable events are. They might be grappling with their sense of morality. The concept of moral injury comes in here, where a lot of people are traumatized because of moral failings or witnessing of events that conflict with their moral code. So maybe they're reconstructing that. So all of this reconstruction through this deliberative process and reflection eventually produces some outcomes that we call post-traumatic growth. And out of the original interviews that we did and the quantitative measure that we developed out of those interviews, which were essentially quotations from what people told us, we did factor analytic studies and found that there are generally 5 different ways people report post-traumatic growth. They report a greater sense of personal strength, psychologically, sometimes physically. They know that they've somehow gotten themselves through a terrible circumstance, and sometimes they say, if I've been strong enough to get through this, I can get through anything. So personal strength is one dimension of this. A second is improved relationships, changed relationships with other people. People report being more compassionate, more empathic, putting more effort into their relationships, feeling closer to other people. This may develop out of the fact that other people have come to their aid, who have been companions with them through the process. They've had to seek out people to get help. Maybe they recognize their own vulnerability that they didn't appreciate before. New relationships with others is another area of change. A third is new possibilities. We call these new possibilities, opportunities to move life in a new direction, having new priorities, something that is of interest to you that might not have been of interest to you before, something that's important to you that wasn't important before. And so you do new things with your time and your life that you might not have considered before. A third area is appreciation for life. This is essentially a gratitude dimension. People are noticing things in life that they took for granted or overlooked before. They're grateful for the lives that they're leading. And maybe because they've lost a lot in this process, they're more grateful for what they have. They see that more clearly. And then the last dimension we call spiritual and existential change, where people are focused on questions of meaning and purpose, why it's important for them to live their lives. And this sense of purpose often extends to altruistic acts. So we have this spiritual and existential change dimension. So those are some of the outcomes that we start to see, and people are different in this. Not everybody shows all those 5 outcomes. Some people show 1 or more, different combinations of these things in different ways. And of course, not everybody who experiences trauma reports post-traumatic growth. And in a lot of the studies of post-traumatic growth, we recognize that we're taking snapshots of people's lives at different points in time. So comes later, because there's all kinds of different trajectories of growth over time. So there's a lot of variability in these reports, and yet the process that we look at is very much the same depending on the kind of trauma that we're talking about. So that takes us through what trauma is and how we define it as a challenge to the core belief system or the assumptive world. That there's a process that starts with the anxiety and confusion that happens when that system is shattered and people don't know how to understand the world they're living in. It's almost like their psychological infrastructure is shattered, like an earthquake would shatter a city, and that infrastructure no longer serves them well, and they have to rebuild it. So there's that process that leads to this rebuilding of deliberate rumination and connection with other people in order to do that, to be able to articulate it and to relate to other people in ways that help people get through it. So that's where what we call the expert companion comes in. People who are very adept at being companions to people who are suffering through trauma and the aftermath of trauma. And eventually, what people start to do is reconstruct that core belief system, and in the process, also a new story or narrative about their lives starts to take shape. So we can think about this in terms of a narrative dimension as well, where people notice their lives taking a turn. There's a turning point. The story changes, and they realize, hopefully, that they're authoring a new story that leads them to these changes in one or more of these 5 dimensions. So what we've done at the Boulder Crest Institute for Post-Traumatic Growth, part of the Boulder Crest Foundation, is try to apply these understanding and all this research to developing programs for these populations that we've been interested in. And so if you look at our programs, there's some aspects of them I think that are quite innovative and interesting. One aspect is that all our programs are peer delivered. So mental health professionals don't deliver the programs. Instead, we have programs for veterans that are delivered by veterans, programs for first responders that are delivered by first responders. And this is because we want to emphasize cultural competency in the aftermath of trauma. For people to really understand what it's like to go through traumatic events, they're best understood by people who have gone through similar experiences and know their culture. So we help people by providing them with expert companions who are culturally competent. Our programs are delivered either through a week-long residential stay at our facilities in different places across the country, across the United States. Or in the case of people who are still serving as first responders, going to their organizations and presenting programs to them at their organizations. And when we do that, what we're doing there is we're getting buy-in from the organizations so that everyone in the organization goes through the program. Because what we're trying to establish is a cultural change in the organization so that it continues to support post-traumatic growth into the future. And everyone within the organization understands how to be companions for each other and support each other when they're doing all this difficult work and this challenging work, which inevitably involves traumatic circumstances. So it's a program of cultural change in a way within these organizations. And we have large police departments, fire departments, and whatnot in places like Miami, Florida, Tucson, Arizona, who have, we have got hundreds of people going through these programs, and there's changes within how policing is done, and it's remarkable when you start to enter into these cultures, and you're invited in because they realize they need help and they're open to change. And then with our programs, we don't do catch and release where we get people for a little while and we say goodbye, but we continue to support them. So in our veterans programs that are residential, for example, we make sure that people have continuing contact with the small groups that they're part of, as well as our staff, over months to come through video meetings like we're having here and other resources that we have a very robust online presence in order to provide that. So what we see in our programs is we've got 5 elements in these programs that come out of our research on the process of post-traumatic growth. One element is psychoeducation. We educate people about trauma response. A lot of people just don't understand why they're struggling the way they do. So we help them understand the physiological as well as psychological responses to trauma that they're experiencing, so that they can come to see that there's nothing wrong or broken about them, but instead they're human beings who are confronted with terrible situations, and this is how human beings respond to terrible situations. So we start to um, we start to convince them that they don't have to think of themselves as broken people who are going to be victims of post-traumatic stress disorder or something like that, and instead they're human beings who are struggling. And then we help them learn emotional regulation processes to calm down that anxiety and confusion that we see in the aftermath of trauma. So we teach them emotional regulation processes, for example, meditative processes. Um, and we do a lot of work outdoors in order to help them experience calming effects of doing things outdoors. And we have them do all kinds of activities outdoors. We have them work with horses, for example, or do archery or kayaking and different kinds of exercise programs and whatnot, in order to learn how to calm the body and the physiological responses that they have. And then we, of course, have a process of telling the story, a disclosure process they have to involve in. So that's a third element. But we're not unlike we're not like other trauma-focused therapies where people are focused on the traumatic event themselves itself. We focus on the aftermath of trauma and the story going forward, what it's like to live in the aftermath of this. And we also focus on what happened before particular traumatic events, the whole life story from when they grew up through where they are now, and then an orientation towards the future. So this starts to create a narrative, which is the fourth element, sort of creating the life narrative where people can understand themselves from this perspective story, because we want people to be looking forward into what the rest of the story might look like, how they might do it. And this brings us to the fifth element of our work, which is involved in planning for the future where they're of service, because all these people we're working with, of course, have entered into a service life, and yet they're knocked out of that in one way or another by what they're experienced. And we want to help them learn again how to be of service and of value, not only in their work life, but in their communities and their families. So we help them develop a plan of service, and so they can understand themselves as kind of classical heroes, people who return to their communities with the wisdom of how to live life well, which gets us back to the whole wisdom component that we started with. So those are the five elements of our programming: psychoeducation about trauma response, emotional regulation, open disclosure, trusting other people about your life and how you're living it and what you're going through, the development of the narrative, which allows people to see the themes in their lives and where this might take them next and what they can author, and then their work of service and purpose and meaning going forward, which sustains people, even though they may still suffer from the fact they've been through traumatic events. It'll be a suffering that's meaningful suffering, not merely suffering or purposeless suffering, but meaningful suffering, which is very, very different. And that's why when we take our measures and we get data on everyone that comes through our programs, we measure not only symptoms, but growth. So, for example, in symptoms of PTSD and depression, anxiety, and stress, and that sort of thing, we see huge decreases over the 7 days of our residential program. And then when we follow up months later, we see these things consistently continuing at those lower levels. So people come into our programs on average way above the thresholds for diagnosis of PTSD. By the time they leave, they're way below those thresholds on these quantitative measures. And then we measure post-traumatic growth and other kinds of positive outcomes, and we see great developments in those areas as well. So we have data that we've published that, and we're continuing to work on, which show those kinds of outcomes because we're very, and how we've been applying the research on post-traumatic growth to our work there. I have just submitted to a publisher our second edition of a book we published in 2018, which is a summary of the work on post-traumatic growth. My colleagues, Jane Shakespeare Finch from Queensland in Australia, Kanataku and Oakland University, and Brett Moore from my work at Boulder Crest. We put together an updated version of that 2018 book, and we've just finished it. It's at the publisher now, as of this week. There we've tried to summarize all the research that we have on post-traumatic growth the best we can do now. If you look at the research on post-traumatic growth, there are now probably about 3,000 studies out there. We're continuing to gather some of that data ourselves too. So with that, maybe we can have a discussion about anything you want to ask me about or talk with me about that comes out of some of what I've introduced to you here.
Thanks a lot so far, Rob. Will be great. So this gave us a real impression of what you have been doing also practically, not only with respect to quantitative research, so which we really appreciate. Yeah. Are there any questions so far? Matthias.
So thank you for that inspiring talk. There is a traumatic event, a deep crisis, and some persons collapse and are shattered down, and some persons have the chance to grow up. And you talked about the effects of the personal growth, so the personal strengths, the social companions, the new possibilities, the new priorities, the new loving situation. And I wonder what are the reasons why the one is resilient and the other one is dying. What are the reasons?
Okay, that's of course you've gotten to the core right away. That's the core question. And so let me say a couple things. First of all, let me take on this question of resilience that you mentioned. Post-traumatic growth and resilience are not the same thing. Of course, resilience is a well-researched, well-known concept. What it means is basically is that people are resistant to the effects of adversity, or they bounce back from adversity relatively easily. What we find in post-traumatic growth is not that. Instead, what we find is people are deeply affected by a traumatic event. They're not bouncing back easily. They're not unaffected. They are affected in a major way, and that's why the core belief system is shattered. And they have so much anxiety and confusion because they don't know what to think about basic issues of living their lives, their own morality, how predictable events are, how controllable events are, how vulnerable they are, all these kinds of things. They don't know what to think about things as basic as that. So it's not resilience. In fact, what starts the process of post-traumatic growth is the same stuff that starts the process that leads to post-traumatic stress disorder. People are deeply affected. Now, what happens is that some of the problems that we see in post-traumatic stress disorder are sort of are part of the pathway or journey towards post-traumatic growth, because we see intrusive thinking, and we see anxiety, we see heightened startle responses, all that sort of thing that we see in post-traumatic stress disorder may be happening for people along the way to what eventually becomes post-traumatic growth. And in fact, post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic stress disorder coexist to a great degree. And yet, if we look over the time in the process, with increasing growth becomes decreasing distress and decreasing symptoms of PTSD. So they start out as things that in the early phases are positively correlated with one another, and then end up later on as things that are negatively correlated with one another, PTSD and post-traumatic growth. And then post-traumatic growth becomes a pathway to resilience. Now we get back to resilience, because as people develop in new ways and go through this growth, they become more resilient. They become able to establish a core belief system that can be resilient to future traumas, just like a city that is rebuilt with better building codes in the aftermath of an earthquake is going to be better equipped to resist another earthquake in the future. Same with our core belief system. We learn something about living life that allows us in the future, when there are traumatic events, well, they're not so traumatic to us, because you say, well, now we get it. Now we understand it. Now we understand ourselves. Now we understand how to live through it. We're more resilient. So we can see post-traumatic growth as part of a process that can lead to resilience in people. Now, getting back to the question of what makes the difference. Okay, so we could say that maybe people that are resilient have been through post-traumatic growth. Maybe that's part of what we're seeing here, you know? So the resilient people who are measuring as resilient, if we look in their history, have them reflect, maybe we find that they've somehow gone through traumatic events and been able to learn some of these lessons. So that may be part of it. We can also say that another part of the story is people who experience post-traumatic growth are fortunate to find expert companions. Some people are fortunate to find those folks in their social environments, and others are not. That makes a big difference. So, for example, as a psychotherapist, people who come to me in the aftermath of trauma are sometimes people who have not been able to find expert companions. So they have to turn to some person like me and pay me, you know, because they don't have these people in their environment. So that's another difference, another distinguishing factor. Now, I know all of you here are interested in personality and personality growth and all that. So, you know, one of the things that we've looked at are personality measures, you know, because maybe there's certain personalities that are more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. And some of the personality measures seem to indicate that people are higher on extroversion and openness to experience, may be more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. Extroversion because, you know, people who are higher in extroversion tend to have more positive emotion, and they tend to seek out other people. Seeking out other people can help you find expert companions, which are helpful in this process. And openness to experience, if you're open to experience, trauma is certainly an experience, and maybe you're better able to accept the fact that those kinds of things happen and move towards those experiences rather than try to avoid, because avoidance coping is not a good way to, a not good path towards post-traumatic growth. So acceptance coping is a better approach, which leads to post-traumatic growth. So those are some of the factors. So people who show post-traumatic growth might be people who find expert companions, who have maybe certain types of personalities, and also, surprisingly enough, people who are deeply affected by trauma. Greater severity of trauma yields more post-traumatic growth, or at least there's a curvilinear relationship where there could be traumatic events that are so overwhelming for some people that they're just too devastating for post-traumatic growth, at least in the near term. But generally more severity, more growth, because events have to be hard enough to challenge the core belief system. So people have to reconsider all that. So you have to have enough of a challenge to produce the reconsideration and reconstruction. So severity of trauma is also related to post-traumatic growth. So those are some of the factors that we can see are involved.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you so much.
That was really helpful. And sorry, that was my younger daughter, and my wife is coming through the yard at home. Thank you.
Okay, I understand.
Okay, so now Amber is holding up her hand for a longer time already. Let me just say this was Matthias, and along with Amber and Andrew, those people are highly appreciated professors in the philosophy of theology, just to give you the background. Amber.
Great. Thank you so much for this. It's really great to hear about your work, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Actually, it looks really, really fascinating and really important. My question is, to some extent, sort of piggybacking off of Matthias's question of, why do some people grow and not others, or why are some people, and it's more coming from my encounters both with those people I know in sort of evangelical religious communities, and also in the coaching industry, which I'm sort of kind of breaking into right now. And it's a sort of kind of toxic positivity, right, and mindset mentality that brings out this normative side of the post-traumatic growth ideas in ways that I find very worrisome. So I really like on your website how you have this like learning how to struggle well. Like, I think this idea of like, it's not that you're not going to struggle, but we're going to help you, struggle better. I really like that notion. That really resonates a lot with me. But at the same time, I wonder how one, like, I'd be curious about practical kind of advice in terms of how does one keep this from becoming a form of like right-siding or secular religious theodicizing, right? Or glorification of the suffering in a way that like, takes that sort of, in the philosophical literature, we sometimes talk about like epistemic injustice and the idea of like not taking seriously someone's testimony that this was a bad thing, right? By kind of playing it up as a stepping stone. And so I guess the question is, what does meaningful suffering look like without being sort of bright-sided or transformed into something like happy or positive or good, or, does that make sense?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that, because I think part of this is people just not paying attention to what we were talking about, and coming off of that and going in some directions that you describe that are worrisome to me too. So, for example, we never say trauma is a good thing. Traumas are bad things. People, people are hurt by trauma. I mean, this isn't good for people. Okay. And we're not talking about trauma as being anything good. We're focused on the aftermath of trauma. What do you do, given it's happened? So we're focused on that. And we're also pointing out that because you experience post-traumatic growth, that doesn't mean that all that is distressing goes away and makes everything better. And it certainly does not necessarily mean that that you're grateful for the trauma. So, for example, I spent 25 years doing support groups for bereaved parents for a nonprofit agency. Sitting with bereaved parents every week for 25 years, I never heard a parent say, it was a great thing that my child died. Okay. So, we can't equate post-traumatic growth with good things about trauma, even though, like I said, in the first page of that first book, there was a guy who said, I'm glad I got paralyzed. All right. But it depends on the circumstances, and you have to be cognizant of that and sensitive to that. So, and then the other thing is post-traumatic growth does not remove all distress. It doesn't make people necessarily happy. Happiness, the whole concept of happiness bothers me, to tell you the truth. Because, this is where people raise the bar on life. And, life involves a lot of struggle and difficulty. That's why we talk about struggle. The definition of post-traumatic growth that we have is the changes people report in the aftermath of the struggle with trauma. Struggle is part of the definition. So it's hard. Sometimes it takes years. And it's also not an easy sort of cognitive intellectual process. It's highly emotional. So let's not leave emotions out of this, because as I said, there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of distress. So that gets lost in all the positivity that you hear from people. And I know that there are some you were talking about, theology. There's some religions that just focus on, on positivity in their religious beliefs and the messages that they give about, the joy and all of that. Okay, but there's another part of human life too that we can't ignore. So, I do my best to try to balance this out and recognize that that this process is not an easy thing for people, and it doesn't solve all problems, and it doesn't erase the memory of traumas that people have been through, but it makes things meaningful, and that's the key. The meaning that comes from this is something that's constructed in the aftermath because people try to create meaning out of this. It's a creation that you can start to see when you're around people who have been able to do this. And the creative meaning comes, I think, almost always from being of service to other people, benefiting other people in some way, doing something altruistic. That's the meaning you create out of this. And that's why a lot of people who go through traumas end up doing something for people who've been through similar traumatic circumstances. Bereaved parents want to help other bereaved parents. Cancer survivors want to help cancer survivors. People who've been in natural disaster want to work in disaster work. Whatever it is, because they know what it's like, and they want to do something. That's great, and that's the altruism that's born of suffering. So those are the messages I try to make clear.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so Andrew, you too, holding up your hand for a long time. Andrew, you're in California. As you can see, we are very international today. So from both sides of the big pond, yeah, people are involved. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. And Richard, thank you. This has been fantastic. I want to maybe return to a theme with which you began, and that was this sort of search for wisdom.
Mm.
Wisdom is this abiding theme. And of course, for those of us who are philosophers, philosophia is this love of wisdom. So I'm curious to maybe have you comment a bit further on maybe the relationship between wisdom and post-traumatic growth. And the background for the question is psychologists today talking about the wisdom family. There's sort of a rediscovery of philosophy as a mode of practice, as a set of practices through which one finds a better quality of life. So I'm just wondering how you understand wisdom. Has it been a theme that's been a part of your work, or was it a catalytic moment in the beginning? And how do you see those relationships?
Yeah. I'm always a little hesitant to talk about wisdom in a way, because I don't
Fair enough.
want to set myself up as the like they say, the sage on the stage,
Just be like Socrates, he didn't claim to be wise.
That's right. Okay. So I think that what people come to recognize in post-traumatic growth is that they do have some kind of enlightenment that kind of surprises them. And allows them to look back on who they've been and how they've lived in ways that in a perspective that allows them to be kind of surprised at how some ways foolish they were before or how uninformed um, and um, and that kind of distinction that starts to happen. I used to be like this. I used to think that these used to be my priorities. Oh, I was so off base. You know, um, that's kind of the feel of wisdom for a lot of people, I think. That's the way it's experienced uh, in terms of the contrast between who I am now versus who I was then. And so for the the ordinary person who goes through this, wisdom is available, and it looks like that. So I think that I would like to democratize wisdom, uh, and um, and not see it as something that's just held by a very few, a handful of people in this world, um, but for people to be able to recognize it in themselves, and to be able to see it through this kind of contrast I'm talking about. And and I think that that also allows people to trust in what it is that they've learned and how they see things differently and continue to use it. Um, and that's very important for the long haul, because of course there are other challenges people will confront. And I think the other part of this, we talk about post-traumatic growth. The wisdom of it, I think, too, is recognize that it's not a destination or an outcome. It's a continuing experience, a way of living going forward, rather than, oh, I've just got it now and I've learned it all, and it's all it's a continuing experience. And so, thinking of wisdom that way, um, instead of a particular code or destination. So I don't know. Those are some of the things I think about. It's it's
Yeah.
it's a practical thing, about how to live life well that that allows you to appreciate yourself in your own life, and at the same time have this impact, this influence on the people around you, that brings them up as well.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Maybe I can ask you a question which basically hooks up on what Matthias asked about resilience. As you said, that personality growth can be a pathway toward what we may call resilience. So I wonder, what actually do you think is the key underlying, the mechanism underlying resilience? So one aspect could be wisdom, as you already said, yeah. But would like to know about how you think about ability, like let's say to or regulating your emotions. As you say in your program, you teach people how, or you ask them to regulate their emotions. So you also said, well, in resilience, some are less effective and they just bounce back. So we have kind of a model where we say, okay, it's not so much about sensitivity, but it's about how to regulate your emotions once you are affected already. So from our perspective, and I guess it's kind of compatible with what you think, but please inform me better. It's that it's not becoming less effective. It's becoming effective, but then knowing how to regulate your emotion, maybe by using the wisdom that you have gathered from experiences and so on.
I think that's very well put. I agree with you that it's not being unaffected by events and your own emotional reactions to them, but
Mm,
like I say, regulating or managing some of the distress of it,
mm,
so that it doesn't create some kind of emotional chaos in you, and as a result, makes it difficult for you to think and understand and plan and act accordingly. So yeah, so learning how to work with those emotions, understand the system. You know, when I talk with my clients, for example, I say, you know, you're an individual system of mind and body, and you have to understand how your system works in order to use it well. Just like if you bought a new car, you know, maybe you need the manual to understand how this thing works. Otherwise, it's not going to work very well for you. So you got to understand yourself. You have to have that kind of insight into yourself and your own emotional responses. And when people get afraid of themselves and their own emotional responses, that's when they have the most difficulty. When they're kind of afraid of what's going on in them, and they try to avoid what's going on in them. So we have to allow people to understand that what's going on is not going to kill them, and they're going to be able to experience it in a way where they can manage it successfully and not have it be overwhelming. So that emotional regulation becomes an important part of this process. Not to just shut everything down, can be managed in a way which feels like, oh, I'm I'm more or less in control of myself here. That's reassuring.
Mhm. Okay, so thank you very much. So it's 6 o'clock, and let me give the last word to Gina, our wonderful postdoc who does a great job in organizing these meetings, maybe to close the session and to show
Yeah,
your face.
yeah. Well, actually, we have a couple of questions for Professor Tedeschi in the
Mhm.
chat. So
Ah,
I think, yeah, I think Sarah is very, very interested and hear from him. So are you able to read the questions, Marcos? Can
Yes,
you?
I see the chat. Yes,
Okay,
yes, I do.
yes.
Yes.
Basically, I see two. Yeah.
Okay, let me just look real quick and then I'll have to go. So let's see. Inherited intergenerational trauma. I see that. Okay. Yes, let me say this about this community perspective and that. You know, this post-traumatic growth concept applies not only to individuals, but applies to groups. It can apply to communities. It can apply to nations. So groups of people, larger groups of people experience traumatic events, of course, natural disasters, warfare, all of this. Um, and out of that, sometimes with the right companions, which sometimes involve people from the communities, leaders, people emerging, there can be great changes in social systems that come out of traumatic events. So I wrote an article back in 1999 about this, and we continue to write about this in our books about how trauma and its effects on larger systems and groups of people can also be turned towards growth and change. Of course, we just came through the worldwide pandemic and that sort of thing. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that people have written about how that's changed different systems, sometimes in some positive ways. Um, so, so yes, there's a way to think about post-traumatic growth beyond the individual as well.
no?
So I'm afraid I'll have to leave it there.
Yeah.
Okay, but
Well,
listen,
thank you
if
very
you are
much for being here
if
with
you're
us.
interested, you can contact me at Boulder Crest Institute. You have my email, Gina. Of course, you have contacted me through email. Anybody is invited to do that. I'd be glad to interact with you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And obviously, especially to Professor Tedeschi. And well, I guess
Thank you.
this is the end. Thank you very much. See you. Bye.
Okay,
Enjoy your
thank you.
weekend.